Today's episode has been brought to you by OfferingTree. If you are wanting to simplify everything and anything to do with online yoga or a yoga business of any kind, make sure to check out this company. I use and love their software, and I tell yoga teachers about it all the time. Your students can easily register, pay, fill out their waiver form, get Zoom links, email confirmations. All of this is automatic when you use OfferingTree. And if you decide to check it out, make sure to use the coupon code over at offeringtree.com/Shannon. That way you'll get a special discount as a podcast listener. Hello and welcome to the Connected Yoga Teacher Podcast. I'm your host, Shannon Crow. I use she, her pronouns, and this podcast is being recorded on Anishinaabeg, Odawa, and Mississauga land, also known as the Bruce Peninsula in Ontario, Canada. Before we dive right in today, I'd like to acknowledge that yoga was taken. The people and the cultures that cared for yoga for so long were not cared for and honored in that process. And I want to be looking at how I, as a white yoga teacher from the West who studied from many other North American white yoga teachers, how can I take care of this practice? And I'm so glad that you're here on this journey with me, especially for today's podcast episode. Because this podcast was created for you so that each and every week, as you are busy doing all of the things of your work as a yoga teacher, of your life as whatever it is that you are in this life, doing all of the things that you do in your day-to-day, that you can connect to information and support and ideas here on the podcast as you're building your yoga business. And that might mean that while you're folding laundry or you're walking your dog or you're driving people around like a taxi, that might be your time where you can listen and learn. And I'm just really grateful for you hanging out here and spending your time here. It means a lot. If you have been listening to the podcast for a while, you know that over here, we do not shy away from difficult conversations. We might mess up along the way and we might learn as we go, but we don't shy away from having these difficult conversations, especially when it comes to yoga. And in this episode today, we're tackling one of those topics that the yoga community has been quite hesitant to approach. So how can we care for yoga's South Asian roots? And really, how can we look at recentering South Asian yoga teachers? I am so honored that Susanna Barkataki is here today with us to share her insights. Oh my gosh, she is a wealth of knowledge on this topic. If you have been a yoga teacher or a yoga practitioner for a while, you maybe already know of Susanna. But for those of you who don't know her yet, she is an Indian yoga practitioner, and her work is dedicated to supporting practitioners to lead with equity, diversity, and yogic values while growing a thriving practice and business with confidence. As the founder of Ignite Yoga and Wellness Institute, Susanna runs 200 and 500-hour yoga teacher training programs. And I have to tell you, connected yoga teachers, if you are looking for a yoga teacher training, check hers out. I am so amazed at the diversity that she brings to yoga teacher trainings. We chatted after this podcast interview about her teacher trainings, and I don't know any others out there that pull in such a diverse group of teachers so that you can really have such a diverse group of people giving you various perspectives. I think it's such a gift to the yoga teachers who do study with Susanna. It's her goal to create inclusive and diverse yoga teacher trainings, and I can tell that she's really doing that work. She's also the author of Embrace Yoga's Roots, Courageous Ways to Deepen Your Yoga Practice, and she's a renowned speaker and trainer on topics like diversity, accessibility, inclusivity, and equity. In today's conversation with Susanna, we talk about what are the two criteria of cultural appropriation. How do we know when it's even happening? We talk about yoga's roots and how that has changed and evolved. We look at the current practice of yoga in white communities and around the world. And Susanna shares more about recentering South Asian yoga teachers and teachings, her thoughts on white yoga teachers sharing yoga, because many of you know I've asked this question over and over in different podcasts where we talk about cultural appropriation. Okay, now what? As a white yoga teacher, do I continue to teach? So we definitely dive into that today. I think you're going to love her answer to this question. And overall, this episode is here so that we can all learn and figure out what is the best fit for us in this world and what will be the most helpful. There is so much that we talked about. I'm thrilled and honored that you get to listen here. I'm so excited that you're here hanging out and spending your time learning. And I am so excited that you get to meet Susanna. All right, let's dive right in and get into today's episode. Welcome to the Connected Yoga Teacher podcast, Susanna. It's great to have you here.
So glad to be here with you in the community, Shannon.
I have really been looking forward to this episode. And before we even dive in and start talking about recentering South Asian yoga teachers, I would love if you share with our listeners anything about yourself, as well as what is the work that you do and who do you do it for?
Yes. I love this question. I am a child of the diaspora, a child of colonization. My mother is British and my father is Indian. I was born in England. And my whole life, I experienced a lot of separation, a lot of messages of not belonging, from people telling my parents they would have to adopt or else they'd have half-breeds, or my parents not being able to find anyone to marry them, discrimination from teachers, counselors, everything like that while I was growing up. And so I really feel like my life has been this continual process of yoga, of finding unity or union around me and within myself with these differing parts of myself. And so because of those life experiences in my teens and early 20s, I grew up with yoga, and it was part of the backdrop of my family culture, but I'd really pushed it away through a lot of that early life, like many of us do with the things that make us unique or different from kind of normative culture in our youth. And I realized it was actually that I needed to turn back towards, that I needed to turn back to these family practices and cultural practices of yoga. And so I was able to do that. And then my path and my mission in the world is to share that expanded practice of yoga when what I'd known from my family, meditation practices, pranayama practices, devotional practices. And then in India, when I lived and trained there and practiced with some of my teachers, this yoga that was so much beyond fitness or what focused on what we look like, that when I came back to the West, I was like, oh, this is what I'm here to share, because it's helped me, like for some of the folks listening, maybe you felt that, wow, I feel so much better in my skin and my body with this practice of yoga, or I feel so much more calm or kind or peaceful. That was happening on a cultural level for me. And I also was told by my main teacher, Shankaracharya, you need to go and teach these practices to those who need them most. And so after that, being a teacher, I came back and began to teach a little bit more of kind of yoga philosophy and things like that in schools where I was a teacher, and then soon writing, sharing more and more and more. So my story, I feel like, has really been one of this medicine of separation to unity, which doesn't mean I have it all figured out, but it is the foundation of my practice.
Thank you so much for sharing this. I feel like what a thing for your parents to go through, and what a thing for you to go through as well. And we know colonization means that many people were hiding, their cultures because it just didn't fit in, or it definitely wasn't celebrated. quite the opposite. And so I'm just trying to wrap my head around, like, I feel like, I don't know how old you are, and I don't know if it's rude to ask, but I feel like you're around my age or my generation. And it feels like not that long ago that your parents will have gotten married, and for them to hit all of this as they were wanting to get married. Like, do you know what year they were married?
Oh gosh, I think it was in the 70s, so the early 70s. And yeah, it wasn't common at that time for folks to have mixed race relationships. And it's in a context, right? Like, I was born in England. I sound like a Valley girl in the US because that's where I grew up for a reason, which I can share in a minute. But they were seeing past color and difference and into love, right? Which is the heart of, I think, what we all feel is we're not just our circumstances. We're not just these bodies. We are something greater. And yet that's sort of the universal dimension, the like capital Y yoga. And yet we're in the world. We're in a historical dimension. We're in certain forms. We have certain privileges or oppressions. And so they were immediately, in this like universal place of love, but immediately confronting violence. There were British boys who would make Molotov cocktails, which are like homemade bombs. And in England, you have, not like in the US, I don't know how it is in Canada or other parts of the world, but your letterbox is actually part of your front door. And so they would take these explosives and stuff them through the front doors of mixed race families, Pakistani and Indian families. And this was happening where my parents were married, and then as they had me. And so they knew, and it didn't happen to our house, but it was happening all around us. And so they knew they needed to leave that context so they could have raise their family somewhere more safe. And this isn't a one-off thing, right? It's a context of colonization, 400 years of British rule of India. And then they were in England, right, trying to live their lives. But that 400 years of colonization under the British, practices like yoga and Ayurveda had been banned and outlawed, and also were really looked down upon for all these years. And so when I was in that space of like trying to understand and trying to reclaim, I talked to my father, I talked to my aunts and uncles and said, tell me about the culture that we come from. Tell me about, the Indus Valley and the Saraswati River Valley, where we know yoga emerged about 2500 BCE to around 500 CE over that span of time, and maybe even earlier. But, they couldn't tell me anything about these civilizations because they didn't learn it. And even my cousins who are my age, which is like 30s, 40s, they also had not learned about their own culture and their own history. And so this is that violence of colonization. It doesn't just impact the people under the colonial rule, it also impacts generations after.
Wow, that is something to think, that someone is trying to stuff an explosive into your door. When you say the violence of colonization, that really hits it home into stories that were happening to mixed race couples like your parents. Thank you for sharing this. We think, we've evolved to this place, hopefully, where we don't have the same feeling for mixed race couples in our society, and yet it's not that far away. And I just want to highlight that as well in terms of cultural appropriation, or if you call it that, some people call it different things, but this colonization of India is not that long ago. If we think of even when I started learning yoga, let's see, I was in my 20s. I'm now 45. I have to do the math.
Yeah, we
quickly.
are almost the same age. I'm just a year or so younger than you.
Yeah. So when I started learning yoga, there was no talk of cultural appropriation. When I took my yoga teacher training, that was not there. My teacher's teacher was from India. And so I feel like this is a pretty new conversation for a lot of yoga teachers. And so what do you say to yoga teachers when they're just starting to learn about cultural appropriation?
Yeah. When folks are just starting to learn about cultural appropriation or yoga itself, right? Like, it's important to acknowledge that yoga came to humanity. It didn't come to any one person. It's not part of any one religion, although it is a component of many religions. But it itself is a practice of liberation and a practice of personal and social freedom. And so we all have our personal relationship with yoga. And yet that's, kind of that universal dimension. But on the historical dimension, yoga comes from somewhere, and it comes from a place and a people. And so as we go deeper with the practice, there's things we can be caring for. One is sharing the fullness of the practice, not just a watered down version of what yoga is, but the full expanse of yoga. So that might mean for you, like all of the 8 limbs, not just asana, or it might mean some of the deeper practices of yoga, like pranayama or mantra or mudra. Mantras, pranayama, like the working with energy, life force energy through the breath, or other practices. Mantra, the sacred sounds. Mudra, sacred gesture. Tapas practices, which are like discipline or focus, austerity practices. Drishti, our gaze. Vichara, viveka, like self-inquiry. So there's so much to this practice, and being a humble student is a great place to start, even if you're already a teacher. I see myself really as a yoga student and a yoga practitioner. And my teaching comes from the wellspring of studentship. My teacher, Shankarji, used to always if I had an aha and was feeling really good about something, he'd be like, "Oh, you think you know a lot. It's just this lifetime, like you have many lifetimes of learning ahead of you." And whether you believe in reincarnation or not, I think that's a helpful perspective to keep in mind. Like, what an incredible thing. This is a practice that has been codified and developed for thousands of years. And maybe, if we've practiced our whole lives, like for me, practiced for, sub 35, 40 years, right? Maybe if you studied it in depth, 20, 30 years, 15, 5, 1, it doesn't matter how long, we're still going to be scratching the surface of what yoga is. And that's okay. I think as long as we have a perspective of openness and curiosity and humility. And so cultural appropriation, it's important, I think, to not just feel like this sense of anxiety or the sense of like, I don't want to appropriate, because that's a really kind of challenging place to come at it from, right? It's like, it doesn't feel good to feel like, I don't want to mess up. Although acknowledging that may be where some folks are feeling, or afraid of being called out, or afraid of being, like blasted for their actions. It's helpful I find, to come more from a place of creativity or passion, which we'll get to in a minute. But to do that, we actually have to understand what appropriation is. And I would say there's always, in the research that I've done, there's always 2 criteria for cultural appropriation to be present. And what's helpful about this is you, or anyone, listening or thinking about these things, can start to assess for yourselves what is appropriative and what isn't. And so you don't have to rely on, like, is this okay? What would this person say? Because that's not always going to be available or helpful. And so 1 is power imbalance, and 2 is harm to the source culture. And so power imbalance is like a differential in systemic power, which is a whole other conversation. I think you probably had some of those conversations with other guests. And then harm to the source culture can be material harm. It can be actually cause like a loss of money, a loss of respect, a loss of all kinds of, bodily harm, all of those things. And it can also be disrespect. So, for example, to bring this kind of into a clear picture for folks, if you're walking down, like I remember walking in Venice Beach, which is a beach side town here in Southern California, with my aunt and uncle. And at Venice Beach, there's a beach on one side, beautiful sound of the waves and sun setting. And on the other side, there's a number of storefronts. And a lot of these storefronts have t-shirts. And one of the storefronts had a shirt with a Ganesh. But this Ganesh had in his 8, or I think it was 6 hands, right? So not even always correctly depicted. They had a gun and a blunt, which is like, like a cigarette. And then just like a knife, things that were not part of what you would put in the hands of a representation of the divine. And my aunt and uncle looked at me and they were like, Beta, child, like, why would they do that? Do they not understand that this is God? Like, this makes no sense. And they were clearly like visibly hurt and upset and distraught. And so that's one example of the impact of cultural appropriation. But there's also material harm, like where folks from the source culture are put down or ostracized or made fun of for doing the very same thing that someone from the dominant culture is celebrated for, like, for example, wearing a bindi. So I'll pause there to see if you have any questions.
Well, just thank you so much for these examples. I know I've been in teacher trainings where everyone was putting a bindi on and there was no conversation around it. And so I just want to say now the Ganesha, please correct me on my pronunciation.
Yeah, I say Ganesh.
Ganesh.
But you can also say Ganesha.
This t-shirt is such a visual example of this. So thank you so much for that. It might be easier for our North American teachers who are very steeped in Christian culture to think that would be equal to seeing, Jesus holding a gun and a cigarette and a knife. And it'd be really shocking to Christians. So those are great examples. I love what you said. You said yoga comes from a place and a people. And you also said, like, yoga, you said something that made me feel like no one really owns yoga. And so I want to get into, because we're going to talk about recentering South Asian yoga teachers. Okay, I have a lot of questions now. First of all, I want to make sure, are we saying South Asian yoga teachers? Is this inclusive of all teachers where yoga originated from?
So, language is always, in a way, a metaphor, pointing to a thing and not entirely describing a thing. And so part of why I say South Asian is because South Asian is a designation that is a political term in the West, in, North America. And so we've got this experience of Pakistanis, Bangladeshis, folks from Sri Lanka, from so many places, Nepal, where yoga has been, and yoga practices over the years has been codified and developed and practiced, where we understand, right, the birthplace of yoga to be. And even that, there's some question about, and part of this is we don't have all of the records or the stories, in part because of colonization, but also just historical. There was so much that was happening that was oral tradition passed down from teacher to student. But the first yogi, the Adi yogi, was Shiva. And Shiva was on Mount Kailash in what is now Tibet and China. And so there, you've got this early practitioner. There's many stories about Shiva practicing austerities. And we know that the Shramana tradition, which, in time, like the way the stories go, Shiva was sitting on top of Mount Kailash for eons, for so many thousands of years. And so there we've got sort of the mythology or the story, but it's not just mythology like fiction. It's actually real to many, many yogis and yoga practitioners. But the Shramana traditions were evolved in, these are like forest monastics, forest practitioners, around 2500 BCE in the Indus Valley and the Saraswati River Valley, which is what is now Pakistan and Northwest India. But those practices, as they developed, it wasn't, again, just one person. It was many different sects, many different groups, often with differing practices for how to reach freedom or how to reach liberation, nirvana. And those monastics or, practitioners, yogis, sannyasis, all different terminology that people would have associated themselves with, they also traveled. And so yogic practices spread across the subcontinent of India and even to Sri Lanka and over, into other parts of Asia. And so when I say South Asian, it's really, there are more folks in the South Asian designation than who are the main kind of where yoga comes from. But just saying Indian isn't enough because we also have Pakistan and Tibet and China and then Sri Lanka as well. So there's nuance there. But for when we're looking at appropriation and we're thinking about power, in the West, those who these practices come from are not just sidelined, not just put to the side, but actually actively erased. And the reason for that is then it makes it easier to appropriate or take on by the dominant culture. And so when I use the term South Asian, it's really for that purpose, to recenter in a political way, just as we've been decentered, those from whom the practice comes, and to broaden that out to more and more South Asian folks who are likely returning to reclaiming their own cultural roots because they've been stripped from them. So it's not always a simple thing, but it's very intentional.
Okay, this is so helpful. Thank you for that. And now here's where my next question comes in. I feel like I hear this thread of, how do I describe this? Okay, so yoga moved around, people traveled, yoga went different places, and sometimes I hear mostly North American yoga teachers saying, well, yoga's here, so let's share it like it's ours, kind of thing. And I want to dig into why that's problematic. Like, why do we need to recenter South Asian yoga teachers? Why can't we just take this like, oh, well, it's traveled around, it's made it to many different places, here it is in North America, and now I want to share it with as many people. And I get where people like myself, someone who's white living in North America, I do really want to share yoga. I see the benefits that I gain from it. So how do we do this, and why is that not helpful to think, well, it doesn't belong to anyone, so I can do whatever I want with it?
Right. Yeah. I mean, yoga is one of the 6 darshanas and schools of like Vedic thought and philosophy. And it originated with other dharmic faiths and practices. And so there's a complete system of practice. And so when we say, oh, we can just take this because it's come to us, the thing is we're missing out on that complete path. And in many ways, changing it and often really watering it down, because what has come to us, and, for folks who are listening, it's like, think about, were you introduced to yoga as a philosophy, as a moral philosophy or an ethical practice, as a way to live in the world, as a way to manage stress or struggles or anxiety? Or as breath and energy practices, or as meditation, or were you introduced more as a physical practice, and perhaps even, for strength or for flexibility? And for many people, not all, of course, in the West, where yoga is all of those things and more. And so when we say, oh, it's just come to us so we can do what we want, unfortunately, we're really cutting off the full, like, I imagine this tree with roots and a trunk and many branches. And we're basically saying this branch, one of, say, 20 or 30, because really there's more than just 8 limbs. There's so many limbs to the practice. This branch, this one branch, is what yoga is. And it came to me, so I have the right to share it. And it's not that you don't have the right to share it. It's more that there's so much more. Don't you want to know more so you can receive the benefit? And the truth is, like, if we keep going in the direction that we're going, in 200 years and 300, 500 years, what yoga will be known as will be like core toning exercises and like booty exercises, right? That's not what it has been for thousands of years and for in the texts. And so there is a responsibility that practitioners and teachers have, I believe, to learn more and to pass along more. Also, the reason that yoga as a full moral philosophy and ethical way of being and living in the world isn't practiced so much in the West is because of the demonization of cultures of color and this assumption that India, South Asia couldn't have complex philosophical or spiritual thought. And so, of course, this has to be just a physical thing because there's no way that they could have had more than that. And so there it's also disrupting the impact of white supremacy and, the harm of cultural erasure, and combating that with looking more about part of how yoga is a complex system that can help all of us, wherever we're from. It doesn't matter, but we can all benefit from a broader understanding of what yoga is.
I love this analogy that you just gave of the tree. I just had in my mind, and I'm also curious, I haven't read your entire book. I just looked over at it and thinking, like, I wonder if this tree analogy is in your book, because you really made me think of this tree rooted in the ground, growing through all the seasons. Like maybe this tree is blooming and whatever, and when you cut a branch off and you run away with it, you're like, I'm going to explain to everyone what this is. You've missed the whole thing. You've missed all the seasons, all the wisdom of that tree, like really the life of that tree. You're just running off with this one little piece. That is such a good analogy. Is it in your book?
That is a good question. I can't remember, Shannon. I'm looking at my book, Embrace Yoga's Roots, for folks who don't know or haven't heard. I think that it might be, but if not, I'll put it in my next one.
Like, I hope you do, because I think that really spoke to me all of a sudden of what it is that we're doing when we say, okay, let's go to this class. Like my first class was, you can only fit so much in a class as well. You've got an hour-long class and we're going to move and breathe and it's taught in the library and off you go. Bye. There's only so much you can fit into that class. Yeah. And at the same time, we know that yoga is so much more than that hour and 15-minute class.
Yeah, that's right.
Hey, Connected Yoga Teachers, I'm popping in here for a moment because I wanted to say a huge thank you to our sponsor, OfferingTree. They have brought today's episode to your ears. A lot of you already have heard about them because I'm here talking about them a lot, or you're a yoga teacher and they're out connecting with other yoga teachers. I use their software. I love it because it makes my life simpler and easier. Like, for instance, when I share my offerings, people can sign up, pay online, get an email reminder, get any Zoom links, and this is all automatic. But I also want to say today, and what you might not know, is how much this company cares about people. For instance, last month, we all heard about the tragic event in Buffalo, New York. And that week, I love that OfferingTree put up a post on Instagram sharing how we could all help that community there. In that, they shared some links that a mutual friend, shout out of love and thanks to DAIE. So in that, they shared links to organizations that are helping. And you can still donate, so I'll make sure to link to that Instagram post. But I just really wanted to highlight, this is why I like to look for and choose companies like this. Companies that are helping different communities, that are aligned with my values, and who really care about the issues that I care about. So thank you so much, OfferingTree. You make my life easier on the tech end of things. And also you care and you're helping people who are in need. Oh, and if you haven't checked out OfferingTree yet and you're thinking that you'd like to, they have a 14-day trial. And also we have a coupon code for our listeners. So it's offeringtree.com/Shannon. All right, let's get back into our conversation with Susanna.
This idea is also in, Indic thought. There's an Indian myth that many of us might have heard in various forms of 4 people coming up to animal, and one touches its trunk and says, "Oh, this animal," and they're all unable to see. This animal has a long trunk that moves. Another touches its leg and says, "Oh, this animal, it's just made up of like joints and it articulates." Another touches its hide and it's like, "Oh, it's large and it's quite smooth." And another touches its tail and says, "Oh, this animal just has a lot of hair and a moving tail." And what they're all touching is an elephant, and none of them understand that all of these pieces work together. And so what we've done with yoga in the West is essentially touch, say, just the tail of the practice or just the leg, rather than understand this whole organic, integrated element that forms this beautiful animal of experience. It's really an experience, especially when you bring in the energetic practices with the chakras and the energy body, that is so much more than just a physical practice, but gets into, deeper questions like, what is the purpose of life? How do we live? What happens after death? How do we manage suffering? There's so many things that our practices actually can support us with if we turn to a more expanded understanding of what yoga is. And I did want to say, not every South Asian, like I'm coming from a certain perspective and certain training and a certain background in the Shankaracharya tradition. My family's from Assam and Bengal, right in the north east of India. And not all Indians think the same thing. Not all South Asians have the same perspective. And so that's in part, and I know I may be getting a little bit ahead, but why it's important to center us South Asians in general, Indians, right, Desis, people from this tradition is, and not just one of us, is we actually have different perspectives, and we always have. There's always been different schools of yogic thought, and that is important. There's a diversity in this tradition and an openness and kind of a agreement to disagree civilly and to have a different perspective from one another, but to be on this path together. And so if you just bring in one person, again, you're kind of missing out, as opposed to like what you've done on the podcast and continue to do is like bring in different teachers, many South Asians, many Desis, to hear different perspectives. And that's so important as practitioners and as teachers to learn from many, many different perspectives.
Oh, I appreciate this so much. How else can we recenter South Asian yoga teachers. And maybe even before that, I'd like to get into, okay, let's say there's me and a South Asian yoga teacher who's teaching down the street at a studio. And, well, let's just be real, like where I live, I don't know any South Asian yoga teachers, but let's say one moved into my very white place that I live in Ontario, Canada. The moment I think that yoga teachers hear, okay, we need to recenter South Asian yoga teachers, is there's an element of like the opposite of abundance, lack, if I share and I highlight this other person, all of a sudden the spotlight isn't on me at my studio, and so then my income could go down. This fear of losing income, like losing that stability, losing that security, and it's uncomfortable. I know that as a white yoga teacher. I know that just as someone living in a society who has definitely centered white people, and I think it's important for white people to be talking about it. I know it's uncomfortable, but let's talk about what actually happens when we recenter South Asian yoga teachers, and how do we do that? And why should we do that?
Yeah. This is a challenging question. And to some extent, it invites folks who are existing in this lifetime in the experience of privilege to really anchor into your practice of ahimsa and non-harm and satya and truthfulness, because there's research by economist whose last name is Utsa Patnaik, that found that Britain plundered $45 trillion. So $45 trillion from India during the British Raj. And even if you're not British, right, those from the dominant culture are benefiting from that extortion or like taking, while those from the culture are still to this day. I have family who live in India, and the experience there is very different than in other parts of the world. And if you imagine that 45 trillion, what that does over generations, the lack of access to that money, it's amazing to think that my father and my aunts and uncles, they were literally born right as India got its independence, just during the independence struggle or just after. And so what that means is that I'm really the first or second generation of those alive, and so are my other contemporary South Asians and Indians who are out from under that colonial rule. So the reason I bring all that up is there's a real consideration for reparations. And reparations are paying restoration or giving money back to resources, back to those from whom the resources have been taken from. And I know that I'm going right for like the most uncomfortable part of this conversation, because really I would ask to folks from the dominant culture, should you be profiting from this practice that comes from a people who have been held down, oppressed, marginalized, and not centered? And in many ways, this is what I meant by like the actual material harm, who've even been stolen from. So when you're thinking about what to do, one of the questions is, well, how can I do this? Like the antidote to cultural appropriation, which, remember, the two criteria, power imbalance and harm, is to flip those. And so yoga cultivates inner power. It really, like, I'm sure folks listening have felt this. And if you haven't, through continued practice, you might. there are many boons, many benefits that come with a deep and rich yoga practice, including like just for myself, for example, with Satya, I used to be so quiet and so shy. I'm still a shy person, but I give talks like this and teach all over. That is a direct result, a boon from my yoga practice, from working with Satya. The boon is people want to listen to me and I feel more comfortable sharing. So that's just one example of the power that yoga cultivates. So when we look at power and balance, we can utilize our power when and where we have it to continue to empower ourselves, but also to lift up others. Because the truth is, each one of us has a particular, energy signature, quality, way of being, people who will connect to you and only you in the way that you teach and practice yoga. And so when you share another teacher's, workshop or anything like that, classes, studio, you're not actually, in the big scheme of things, losing out. Because if coming back to like that why, like why are you practicing? Why do you practice? Why do you teach? And if you truly want more people to feel more free, more peaceful, more joyful, then it's great that there's another teacher who may have a different piece of the puzzle that students will come to you, they'll go to them, and there'll be this kind of flow back and forth. It is a practice that really works to burn away the granthis, the attachments, the ego, to share like that. And so I personally have made it a practice of my own. If I see something that another teacher is doing, for me, like say particularly a South Asian teacher or group, that I'm like, oh, I could have done that, or I have done that, or I do that I may feel a moment of contraction, like, that's mine, that's my thing. Why are they doing that, right? And then I connect to that why. Well, of course, I want more people to understand this. And I always take the response of sharing. So if I feel that contraction, I take it as a message to expand. It's the primordial, like the spanda, right? Like when there's contraction, respond with expansion. And what's happened, and in this is just, again, it's a personal example. Of course, your experience could be different, but this was happening for me a lot during like 2013, 14, 15. I was writing about cultural issues in yoga, cultural appropriation. No one was really paying attention. I was feeling very contractive if I saw other people doing similar things. And then I began this practice of sharing. And do you know what happened, Shannon, is not only did I start to feel better, because instead of feeling and staying stuck in that like insecurity or jealousy or contractiveness, it's like, okay, whatever's going to happen, they're doing good work too. Let me share it. But my career actually started to grow the more I shared. And so again, I'm not guaranteeing that will happen for everyone, but my experience and also what I observe with many people is the more we actually share those who are like us or different than us, actually, the more there is to go around. And so it's just a practice to invite you to take on. It's, it's like pratipaksha bhavana. It's the, if you have and this is in the Yoga Sutras, I think it's Sutra 1.34. I'd have to look in my book, which I can do in a second. But if you have a thought, a contractive or, kind of a thought of separation or isolation, to notice it and then replace it with an opposite thought, a thought of expansion or an action even of expansion and sharing. And so that would be the practice I would invite you into. You can look at why and you can remind yourself of all the reasons, but really, to me, it's being in that practice that creates the change.
Oh my gosh, I love this story so much in that you felt this as well. And I think we all do at some point as entrepreneurs, as yoga teachers. You look over for a moment at, there's that saying like, keep your eyes on your own page, but we look up for a moment, someone else is doing something similar or someone else is doing something and we wish we could do it. It happens all the time. It's part of the human way of being. And I love how you said this is our practice when we feel that to see. And I have to say 100% yes. When I've worked on collaborating with people who do even very similar things to me, it makes, like, I've seen my business grow. I've seen everyone benefit from that. And especially around recentering South Asian yoga teachers, I learned so much when that happens, whether we do it here on the podcast or other people are doing it. I've learned so much more about yoga. So talk to us about, we can do that. We can collaborate with people. Is there anything else? And then what do you see as the benefits of this?
Yes. So absolutely collaborating and also, like you said, like being in that studentship of, I can learn from this person. Like even when in the teacher trainings that I run, I love to we have like 20, sometimes 30 faculty and many other South Asian faculty as well, and other diverse experiences, folks of color, bigger bodied folks with disabilities. Regardless of what they're teaching on, when they're teaching, I'm always in the place of, I get to learn from this person, and real humility and kind of awe at that. And so taking that on as a practice as well of collaborating and learning from other teachers. Also owning your positionality, meaning where you have privilege to act from that place of privilege to lift others up. And if you experience and where you experience marginalization, like for example, as women or with disabilities, or if you're an immigrant or class inequity, to know, part of our practice, right, with this power balancing is to be able to form relationships across difference. And then if we're doing our work kind of right, like there's no right or wrong, but the places where I experience marginalization, other folks will lift me up and I can call on them and develop these communities of intersectionality, which is like awareness that, say, with my white trans friends, they may bring me in the door where I never would have had access. And then I may, as a cis person, a woman who identifies with the gender I was assigned at birth, that's what cis means, if for folks who might not know, as a cis person, I can bring that trans friend in to a conversation or a community or a teaching space where they may never have been brought in. And so there's this way that we can continue to lift one another up, that really, for folks listening, this boils down to relationships, like having relationships with those who are different than us and being kind of in it for the long haul. Even if I mess up, even if I feel uncomfortable, even if I misgender someone, for example, continuing with this particular relationship that I'm thinking of, that I can sit with that discomfort and not jump to rush to fix it or apologize, because it's really not about them. It's about me learning and doing better. So
I just want to say first, this is so good that you're not only looking at recentering South Asian yoga teachers, you're thinking about all of the differences and those connections, like a web going out where everyone has this equal power. I feel like we've been fed such a myth that this power structure that we have existing in the world right now is actually even serving anyone, including, like, it might look like, well, white people are on the top of this power pyramid, and some people might feel really uncomfortable hearing that, but that's actually the way it's set up. We did a great episode with Michelle Cassandra Johnson on this. And when we can break that apart and restructure that, we all benefit. Like, we're actually not benefiting from being in power as white people as well. I guess that's what I want to say.
Right. Yeah. That's the heart of it, Shannon, right? Is like we think that we're benefiting the places where we have privilege, but actually it's harming us too. And this is the other, I wanted to get to this part of like the alternative to cultural appropriation actually isn't just not appropriating, it's creativity. It's plugging back into your cultural roots, your heritage. Many of us, like on my British side and French side, there are pagan roots that are connected to ley lines, to energy, to elemental connections, to nature that mirror and echo some of what we find in yoga and as an earth-based practice, but are unique. And so the more that as I'm reclaiming my own cultural heritage and learning, say, on that side, and I'm speaking to that side of me, and for those who may be existing in European or white bodies and experiences in this lifetime, in this moment, is like we have culture too. And being told that we don't is actually also colonization. And it's harmful because we get to be in relationship with, say, our anti-racist ancestors or our spiritual ancestors, our land ancestors, and connecting creatively to what it is that we can bring forward with joy, with courage, with connection. And then when we share or connect to other practices, other traditions, doing it in an honoring and a respectful way. It doesn't take a whole lot. It's pretty simple. I have a whole part in the book about spiritual lineage acknowledgement and what that is, the way we might do a land acknowledgement. Like if I say to you, I'm coming to you from Chumash and Tataviam land, acknowledging this unceded land and those who tended the land and tend the land. And I'm about to share a practice of yoga that comes from South Asia, comes from India, and it is a diverse and rich practice. Today, we're going to do asana, which is one of many limbs of yoga. Now we'll begin in balasana, in child's pose, right? So I managed to acknowledge the land I'm on, acknowledge the history and the context just enough to, in an hour-long class, to let people know there's more to this than just what we're going to do. This is one part. And to really come from that like space of respect, that space of honoring, I think can go so far.
Oh my gosh, I love that. You did that so quickly of honoring the land, honoring the practice and where it comes from. And then also saying, I love this addition of this is just one part of yoga that we're going to do today. Oh, I hope that all of our yoga teachers take that away. This is so great in terms of the creativity and passion. I guess I want to dig into one other tough question. There have been times where me as a white yoga practitioner and teacher, I've thought, should I even be teaching yoga? And I know that some of our North American yoga teachers living in white bodies have built their careers on this and built their families rely on it. So what would you say to people who are asking that question?
I mean, the very first thing is I don't think any one person, no one else can answer that question for you but you, right? Like, because I get this question a lot, like, I'm white, should I teach yoga? And I would always say, I'll give you some thoughts and some things to reflect on, but ultimately, I wouldn't be doing my job as someone who is a student of this practice if I told you what to do, because the guidance of yoga is to come back to svadhyaya, sva, self, dhyaya, study, but also swaraj, self, swa again, and raj, rule, self-rule. And that is only something you have access to. So considering ultimately, is what I'm doing creating more separation or more unity? If yoga is unity, union, then is my teaching in this way creating more separation or more unity? Then if it is causing separation in certain ways, like say, for example, you're practice or your teaching is very much able-bodied, very power yoga focused, then what are the ways perhaps that you could shift that? Maybe bring in a practice, teach some restorative classes or some yin classes. If your community or your practice is very monoculture, very white, then are there organizations or folks of color or other teachers who you could collaborate with or lift up or bring into your teacher training or your workshops? It's not an all or nothing. And then, really continuing to be in studentship, as we've talked about, and learning more and more about what this practice is and all of the vast array of it. And then the last piece is really considering in the way that like the Gandhian movement or the nonviolent movement for satyagraha, for truth force, as a method of political and social reform to make India a free country, is living your yoga as action, like to keep inquiring into truth, your truth, but also the truths that maybe emerge when you listen in such a way that other people's truths come into being, and to practicing ahimsa, non-harm, and really like, how can you be brave in that practice? Like connecting to the land, the blood, the spiritual ancestors of yoga, and continue to be in relationship with that question. Let the question guide you. Come back to it, journal in it, sit in meditation and dhyana with it, focus on it instead of shying away from it. Because perhaps, there will be seasons where your practice emerges or your teaching emerges in one way, and seasons where you explore and share in a different way. But there's so much good that you can do from all of the different answers to that question that, again, only you know. And you do know in your heart and in your spirit. And if you aren't sure, then you get to sit in that inquiry. And that is your practice. And that's a beautiful, beautiful practice.
Oh, this is so amazing. I love it. I love it. I love it so much. I was like grinning, like when you were asking, is this bringing unity? Is this ahimsa? These are such good questions to dig into on our own. Is there anything else that you can think of that you'd really like yoga teachers to know other than to read your book? I highly, highly recommend it to dig into this a little bit further. But is there anything else that you want to close out with if we're looking at how we can recenter yoga teachers?
Yeah, yoga is here as a way for us to connect, and we can relate to yoga as this guide and exploration towards yoking all the things that have become separate, not so much to create more separation, but to create more unity. And that includes with ourselves. So looking at the places where we may feel disconnected from ourselves and caring for that, as well as showing up with this devotion to yoga, really being all in with yoga, with the practices. I recently went through this experience. I don't know if you've ever had this, Shannon, but where I wasn't feeling so good, like emotionally, physically, I just wasn't feeling great. And I thought, well, what do I do? How can I still teach yoga when I'm not feeling the benefits of yoga? And then I had this realization that this doubt or insecurity or imbalance, whatever it is, doesn't actually make me less of a practitioner. It can make me more of one if I turn towards it with that all inness. And I can share the practices themselves because the practices are independent of me. They don't rely on my experience. The practices, these tools are in many ways very universal. And yes, we can attune them to who's in front of us, but the practices work. And so are you showing up in a way that's letting yoga know how valuable it is in your life? and really being all in to this with this practice in your own life and in how you share it. So I would just close with that. It's like your relationship with yoga it's profound and it's direct and it's hopefully liberatory for yourself and others.
I'm so glad that you shared this with us, that you also have moments that you're not just like living this euphoric, blissful day-to-day existence because you've connected so well with yoga that we're all here in this mess at times together. That's really reassuring. And gosh, I could talk to you all day, but I want to let our connected yoga teachers know, how can they study with you, learn with you more? Where do they find you and connect with you?
Yeah, thank you, Shannon. So I teach 2 yoga teacher trainings a year, a 200-hour and a 300-hour, and you can explore that at embodyyogasroots.com. I love teaching. It's my passion, and the programs very much center this depth of yogic history and practice, and also making it relevant for us today. And then I do a lot of, if you want to access more like low cost or free education, I do a lot of educating on Instagram, which is my name, Susanna Barkataki. And I have a book, as you mentioned, Embrace Yoga's Roots, and a workbook that really kind of brings in these questions of inclusivity and belonging and how we can bring that into our practice. And those you can find on my website, which is my name, Susanna Barkataki.
Amazing. We'll make sure that those are all in the show notes, our links. Thank you so much for your time today and all that you are doing in this world.
Thank you so much. And just sending so much appreciation to you and to the whole connected yoga teacher community. Really, really appreciative of each one of you.
Goodness, thank you so much, Susanna, for all of your time, for the book that you've written that I absolutely love. Connected Yoga Teachers, if you haven't checked out this book, get it from your local library, go get it from your local bookstore. And I would love to hear your thoughts on the book. What really popped out to you? How are you doing the work right now? My key takeaway in this episode was really, I jotted some notes down as I was talking with Susanna, and it was really about collaboration. That's something that I love to do. Learning, using my own privilege, and showing up and really sharing yoga in other ways, not just teaching yoga, but how can I, show up with all of the limbs of yoga out in the world as I'm doing my day-to-day stuff. It gives me comfort to look for, how can I help? How can I take action? It can also be something that kind of gets in the way. Shout out to my brother Conrad, because sometimes he'll call me just to tell me about, one of the things that's going on in life. And I start offering suggestions of mostly action. And he's like, I'm not looking for a solution. I'm just wanting to share. So he definitely calls me out on it. It does get in the way sometimes. But I do take comfort in finding action, and helping others really helps me to dig into something when it's upsetting. So I'd love to know what you took away from today's episode. And I also want to tell you that this ties in really nicely with our next couple of episodes, where we are going to talk about land acknowledgements, and then we're going to talk more about culture and religion and yoga. So June is a packed month here, if you're listening in real time, where we really dive into some tougher topics, but topics that I know we are getting a lot of questions about from our connected yoga teacher listeners. So I'm excited that we get to dive into this together. I also want to give a shout out to Carly of Radical Rest Yoga. Carly left a review and said, "I'm so grateful for this podcast as a resource to continue to develop, refine, and challenge my yoga practice as teacher and practitioner while folding laundry, LOL." Shannon's topics and guests are diverse. I love her thoughtful, curious, warm approach to the interviews. I always leave an episode with more questions than I had at the start in the best way. Thank you so much, Carly, for leaving this review, for taking the time to listen to the podcast. And I love how you said that you're leaving episodes with more questions. I think that's what happens when we learn. I hope it is. I hope that when we learn something, we walk away with more questions, with maybe a new perspective as well, or a view into someone else's perspective. And this makes me really happy. So thank you for sharing, taking the time to leave a review. If you have not done that yet, Connected Yoga Teachers, please do so. I just have to tell you, years ago, I was listening to a podcast when I was new to podcasts. And on the podcast, they were like, leave a review. And if you post on Twitter and you leave us a review, we'll send you a chocolate bar. And I was so excited. I was like, okay, I'm getting on Twitter, which I never go on Twitter. I'm going to get on there and say how much I love it, tag them in it. And then I'm going to get on Apple, take some steps to leave a podcast review, as anyone knows if you've ever done it. I do that. I wait. And guess what, Connected Yoga Teachers? No chocolate bar. So I'm not going to promise you a chocolate bar. I realized afterwards that was a ridiculous thing. Of course, they're not going to mail out chocolate bars to me, but there should be a prize. The only prize that I can offer you is that I read them, and I love to read them out here on the podcast and give a shout out. So we'll link to Carly's website in the show notes, because I know Carly reached out to me on Instagram and said, I left you a review. And I looked up Carly's website, and it's radicalrestyoga.com. And it's an OfferingTree website, which I found out. And Carly even did a little OfferingTree audio clip a few episodes back. The world is a small and magical place sometimes. So thank you so much, Carly, for taking the time to leave a review. And Connected Yoga Teachers, if you haven't done that yet, I highly encourage you to do that. And I will give a shout out. Tell me where you're from. You can put your website in there if you want to, if you want me to give a shout out to that as well. And tell me what's the yoga that you teach, where do you teach it, and I'll share it here on the podcast. And I'll mail you a chocolate bar. No, I won't. I will not. I don't want you to be like me waiting by the mailbox for your chocolate bar. Also, make sure to check out our show notes page. That's over at theconnectedyogateacher.com/276 for today's episode. We have clickable timestamps, so if you want to go back to a certain spot in today's episode and re-listen to that, or if you want to see some notes about today's episode, that's a great place to go. And also, scroll down to the bottom and leave us a comment there. We love to hear from you. Or we can hang out and chat about today's episode in the Connected Yoga Teacher Facebook group. If you're not already a member, come on over and join us. It's a super amazing, supportive group of yoga teachers from around the world. I think there's 11,000 plus yoga teachers in there now. You can find out how to join by going to theconnectedyogateacher.com and look for the join button on our homepage. If you want to hang out together, Connected Yoga Teachers, I want to tell you about a live call that we have coming up inside of Pelvic Health Professionals with Leslie Howard. Leslie Howard is an expert in both yoga and pelvic health, so you know that I love to talk to people like this. Leslie is a return guest actually coming in to talk with us, and we're going to talk about the energetics of the pelvis. That's happening July the 18th. Oh, and if you're listening in real time and you listen to the episode the Monday that it goes out, you might actually be able to catch our live call with Michelle Lyons, where we're going to talk all about bowel health. That's June the 13th. But if you are listening at any point after these dates, not to worry. All of the replays are inside our library over at pelvichealthprofessionals.com, and you can learn along with us. All of our yoga students have a pelvis. They all have a pelvic floor. And there are many parts of this area that are not covered well enough in yoga teacher training, in anatomy classes, in medical trainings, in physio trainings. It's amazing how we skip over so many parts of the pelvis, but not inside of Pelvic Health Professionals. We hire worldwide guest speakers, and experts. We pay them so that you can show up and ask your questions, get your answers, and learn from leading pelvic health experts. We take notes for you. It's super in-depth in there. We even have a search function so that you can search all of the previous transcripts. It's pretty amazing over in there. If you are wanting to check it out, head over to pelvichealthprofessionals.com. Thank you so much to our entire team who has helped bring this episode to you today. Suzanne, who works on the audio, Crunch, who writes and travels, and Sinead, who supports our community in so many ways. And thank you, dear listener, for hanging out here. Like I said early on in today's episode, this is one of those topics that sometimes we can shy away from. Sometimes we might think, I would be better off to listen to a podcast about how to cue this particular thing, or how to teach and become a better teacher, or how to manage my money as an entrepreneur. Those are important things as well. And also, it is so important that we're taking care of the roots of yoga. And so I just want to say thank you for taking the time to really dig into this topic today. And I'm also curious, what will you be doing this week to stay connected to yourself, your yoga practice, and to your community so that you can share the yoga that lights you up?